Thank you so much. Best panel ever, you guys. I'm not going to have to work very hard at all. They're all gems. So quickly, before we kick off our panel, I would love to just take a quick poll of the audience. So how many editors do we have in the room? Just raise your hand. Oh. Ooh, nice work, guys. How many firsts do we have in the room? All right, respectable. Seconds, thirds.
Why am I the only one applauding?
And students, trainees, aspiring. All right. All right, no pressure, guys. Room full of editors. So before my first question, I would love to ask you, how did you get your editing break? How did you make the move from assistant, if you were an assistant, up to being an editor? Who helped you? Who pulled you up? Who gave you that opportunity? Tom, I would love to start with you.
Well, I assisted for many years. I got my career start in New York. I was an assistant editor at a commercial company. And I kind of worked my way. I always wanted to do movies. I always wanted to work on features. And I kind of made my way through all the different genres in New York, because that's kind of what you do. There aren't a lot of movies that cut there. So I worked in documentary, I worked in TV promos, industrials, commercial spots, just about everything except for the thing that everyone always thinks I did, which is music videos. I've never actually cut a music video. But I worked in a lot of different genres, and my break into features was when I assisted this editor, Tim Squires, on a commercial. He was in between features, and he was looking for an assistant to help him with this commercial spot he was cutting. So someone recommended me, and I got on with him. I assisted him on this commercial, and then he went on to start a feature, a small indie feature, and he took me along with him. That was my first union job in New York. And so that's kind of how I broke into features, assisting. And then eventually I moved to LA, and I kind of still assisted, and I did that for many, many years. And I worked for a lot of great editors who I learned a lot from. I hooked up with an editor named John Axelrad, who I worked with on 5 pictures. I was his assistant, and he gave me a lot of encouragement, gave me scenes to cut. I did a lot of additional editing with him, and that kind of is what paved the way for me to, I guess, get an extra appetite for editing. I always wanted to be an editor, but I was very content for a while assisting, because I had this thing where I always wanted to be an editor, but I always wanted to, I had this very highfalutin idea that I wanted to learn from the masters, And so that didn't end up happening the way I thought it was going to end up happening, but I certainly had my own masters that I learned from. And then it was a kind of junior producer who I had worked with as an assistant editor, a junior producer, a guy named Cooper Samuelson, had this project he was trying to get off the ground, a feature film about a jazz drummer. And he had a script and he had the director, but no one wanted to finance the movie. They couldn't get financing. And so they decided they were going to take 20 pages out of the feature script, and they were going to get a crew together to shoot it and to cut it. And then, hopefully the financing would come through, and then all those people would get to work on the feature. And that project was Whiplash. And so he sent me the script, and he called me, and I always feel like he called me because I guess he thought he liked me, but I think mainly he called me because I was cheap. So he called me, and I said, "This sounds great. Send me the script." And at the time, I'd cut a couple little indie features, but I was trying to really trying to make the break to editing, which was very difficult. And he sent me the script, and it was like one of the best scripts I've ever read. I said, I'd love to meet Damien. I had coffee with Damien, and we found that we liked a lot of the same movies. We hit it off, and we started talking about editing in certain movies and that we loved, and said, let's do this. And so I got to work on this short film with him, which was the short film version of Whiplash. And then that and we worked well together. We had a lot of fun. And that got sent to Sundance, where it won an award. Best Short Film, and then the financing came through. And my biggest fear was that the financier, this new company coming in, wouldn't want me to cut it, which actually is true. They didn't want me to edit it. And in fact, none of the crew who worked on the short got to work on the feature film. And the lead actor was different as well. The only reason it happened, Damien wanted me, but at the time he had no clout really. This producer, Cooper Samuelson, wanted me to do it, and he sort of told the financier, look, we know this more prominent editor, more experienced. He'll be waiting in the wings in case we have a problem. So don't worry, Tom can do it, but if there's a problem, we'll bring him in to take over and clean up, And luckily for me, it was someone who I used to assist, who was friendly to me and agreed to kind of lend his name. But the truth is that the schedule was so bad, the schedule was so tight, and they started shooting September, and we had to deliver to Sundance in early November. The first thing I told my crew was, the great news, guys, is there's no time to fire us. So that was, I'd say that was my big break,
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Amazing. Elliot, how about you?
Yeah, I got really lucky, but it started with just cutting everyone's short films at school, because nobody else seemed to want to be locked in a small dark room, but I did, and
I think we can all empathize with that quite a lot.
And interning on weekends and summers, and I was interning the summer before my senior year, and down the hall from this Terrence Malick film that was also cutting the Thin Red Line. And there were 3 editors on that. One was a young guy, Sarah Klein. I don't know if you guys know him. And he took me aside right before I left to go back to school and said, I asked him advice about getting into editing. He said, well, you just have to cut no matter where you go, whatever you're assisting on. If they won't let you cut, go somewhere else, and you need to cut to cut. So I took that advice.
That's great advice.
I stalked an editor named Mark Goldblatt. I didn't know many editors. Mark cut lots of Jim Cameron movies like Terminator 2 and Michael Bay stuff. Spectacular editor.
Nice guy.
Very nice guy.
Yeah.
And it took like 5 letters and 10 phone calls, and eventually he said, okay, just shut up and I'll have lunch with you. And we had lunch, and I thought that was the end of it, but a week later I got a call from this director, Steve Norrington, who doesn't direct anymore, but he did the film Blade with Wesley Snipes, the vampire hunter film, and he shot a film. He was going to edit it himself. He shot it in London. He moved back to LA to cut it. He was cutting out of James Cameron's Lightstorm Entertainment because they were friends. And he decided, after trying to cut it on film by himself without any assistance, that wasn't going to work. So he asked Jim Cameron where he could get an assistant, and Jim called Mark. And Mark said, I don't know anybody, because he only wanted to pay like $500 a week. Yeah. But I met this college kid who probably would do it. So so I got the job, and it turned out that Steve Norrington worked 7 days a week, 18 hours a day. And I was commuting from my parents' house, which was about 2.5 hours away, and this didn't work. So I slept on a few couches, and then I just moved into the editing room because there was a bathroom, because it's Jim Cameron, so they had showers in the bathrooms because people don't leave there. And I lived at Lightstorm for about 2 months. Wow. And there was an extra Avid down the hall. We just had one Avid for Steven, but there was one just sitting there left over, and I asked if I hooked it up, if I could use it without any media share. So if I would cut something, we'd have to recreate it on the other side. But Steven said, sure, cut in your spare time, which was, all night because I lived there. And I ended up cutting half the film without him saying you can have an editor credit. But he gave me an editor credit at the end, and I couldn't get big films off that, but I was able to get music videos. And then when I went aspiring to be on another film, X-Men 2, Steve knew Bryan Singer and recommended me for it, and bizarrely got the job.
That's fantastic. Such hard work. And the advice as well, just cut.
Yeah, just cut. You can assist all the time, but make sure you get the chance to cut. And if you're not, it's time to move on at some point.
Yeah, it's good advice. Ginny?
I have such an easy answer. Nepotism. My father was a film editor in New York and had his own company. And one summer, in between semesters, They wouldn't let me just go hang at the beach, so I went into work with him and never left the cutting room. I mean, it was just one of those things. I feel like, I always say the same thing because I feel that the whole kind of steps to becoming an editor for me were like just blessed because was my father, and I learned from him, and from really within like the second week he was giving me, and that was on film back then, he'd say, "Here, cut this," as a scene, and I had no idea what to do. So if somebody spoke, I'd cut there. If somebody spoke, I'd cut there, and eventually, obviously, over the certain time, I started to realize things about timing and all that other stuff. And so he was, my first mentor, and then I went on to work with, which was very important to me too, to work with a woman editor when I moved to California, because in New York, and there was like Dee Allen and very few women editors. And starting young, I'd get the, "Honey, is your father there?" Type thing. And so I really, the lesson being, I went on to work with this woman in LA. My first job's in LA. And she was so difficult strong, not difficult to many, but it wasn't personal, and I learned so much from her about being a woman in the business, and of course now there are many more. But anyway, so I started, and then my next, it's like that. So that's number two, and my third, of course, I went on a film with her, with a young director named Bill Condon, and it was his first directing job, and I was in the middle of the swamps of Louisiana. That was fun. Mosquitoes the size of ravens. And then, and we became friends. I ended up doing some of the cutting, and again, it does go back to, start cut, the minute, if you're working, especially as you get more and more experience, I hope that, I always give my assistants scenes to cut. I just think it's so important. And Marion, I had cut for her, this is that editor, and became close with Bill on this film, and he saw my work, and from that point on, which was now many years ago, I've worked mainly with Bill Condon and other editors too. I'm working with a different, not editor, director. I'm working with a different director, which is a treat too, because you, after many years, it's just nice to step aside and just experience something different. But so Bill was the third blessing, and that's how you just it's all been for me. I felt very lucky.
How old were you when you first stepped inside the cutting room?
20.
That's amazing.
20.
I would have killed.
and I didn't start working until I was about,
even to be in that environment,
and it was, my father had this floor in the one of the old Technicolor building, and he'd bring his dog, and so I grew up with the dog in the cutting room, and and basically, because I knew he couldn't fire me, I learned to be able to speak and say what I felt, and so it was a great.
Yeah,
it was a great blessing, really.
My takeaway is more dogs in cutting rooms.
I have my dog with me, by the way, from Los Angeles. He comes with me. He's got his little service thing. Aww. He walks on the airplane on a leash. He's perfect.
You have to train him to retrieve trims.
He comes.
Exactly.
I give him the difficult scenes.
Right.
And Paul, how did you make the jump?
Well, actually, just hearing all these stories are quite interesting because mine is seems to be completely different in the sense that my background probably was more television and technology, basically. I had a father. My father was a copywriter and a producer in Melbourne, Australia, and I'm probably fascinated, just by the technology that was being used. And I remember I was about 5 or 6, and I remember going to an edit. He invited me to see some post work on a commercial that he'd shot, and of course this was being done on videotape, and it was the first facility that could edit color videotape using computer technology, the CMX system. And of course, videotape then was huge 2-inch quadruplex machines. They were about 6.5 foot high. I'm this high, and I find myself wandering into the machine room and just kind of standing in front of this machine. And of course, it's steaming away. It makes, uses compressed air, so it's just buzzing and humming and flashing. And I just say, I'm not quite sure what's going on, but I'm going to be sort of a part of this. And it was really a decision then that kind of led me into whatever was going to happen. It was going to be part of this business. And then coupled with that, growing up and basically becoming a huge fan of British comedy. And that was the driving force for me, is just because the ABC in Australia would buy a lot of stuff from the BBC and Thames and all the shows.
What were your favourite shows?
Well,
the home audience here.
I missed the initial run of a lot of things, but I fell into kind of the Goodies,
right.
and Monty Python and Kenny Everett, especially in the ABC. They would show them once a week in England, but they would strip them 4 nights a week. So you'd basically have Spike Milligan, the Goodies, Kenny Everett, Doctor Who, 4 nights a week. And so you'd come home from school, and that would be my kind of education for the for the afternoon. Coupled with that, I started going in on days off from school. I started going to Dad's advertising agency, and they had a little an editing setup, but it was kind of U-matic to U-matic, so linear editing. And I would borrow their agency's camera, which was this big camera and this VHS camcorder. You'd have to kind of strap it, so you'd put that there. I'd put the camera there, and I'd promptly fall over because the weight was just too much. But then I'd try and get my school friends involved in making little films, and then I would go back, transfer it to the U-matic, and then literally try and teach myself the right and the wrong of doing things. But at the same time, watching all this fantastic comedy, getting an understanding of timing, getting an understanding of what was funny, that of course it wasn't necessarily about what the editing was doing, it was much about the writing and what the cast, and just basically all that element to make up this thing that completely fascinated me, and I wanted to be a part of it, basically. And I finished school, and before I was meant to go to university, I did a week's work experience at a television station in Melbourne, and they offered me a job just as a runner on the floor, and I was probably 17 at the time. And the first thing I was doing was on a sketch comedy series, and that was great because starting there, you just got to learn everyone and everything and all the jobs. I kept gravitating though towards the videotape department, because that was really what interested me, was the post-production side of it. And I eventually got a job at a post facility in Melbourne, 3 or 4 years doing that, and then basically learning sort of online editing and going from 1-inch to Betacam to Digibeta, and still layering everything up. So there'd still be a room where there would be a vision mixer for switching, a DVE for alternating shots, a mixer, a sound mixer for everything. So and it would all have to try and work together. So that was a fascinating experience. I then got in via some circuitous route to do some product demonstrating for Sony, and I went out to NAB, and I met some people from Sony UK there, and I kind of, as you do when you're young, sort of said, well, if you need someone to sort of help show the ropes at the IBC trade show in Amsterdam in September.
Speaking of, do we need to explain what NAB and IBC are for everyone? So NAB is a massive, massive conference in Vegas. 100,000 people go every year, descends on Vegas. It's absolute carnage.
It's where all the new technology, which is about a year or two ahead of time, is shown and demonstrated. And,
so that happens in April, and then IBC happens in September.
In September, that's right.
Yeah, but in Amsterdam, so it's the same sort of thing.
Absolutely.
Huge shows.
Enormous. And so I kind of said to this Sony UK lady, you know, if you need anyone, I would be happy to do it. Thinking, if they say yes, that'll be my ticket to England. That'll be the opportunity to come over here. I thought they'll never ask me because I'm 13,000 miles away. They'll have people in London, you know, and so then that fortuitous day when a fax, as it then was, arrived, you know, saying, could you be in London in 3 weeks? And so the next day I bought a plane ticket. The day after, I resigned from work, and 3 weeks later, much to my mum's delight, I was on a plane out to London, and I didn't know anyone. I turned up to Heathrow with a suitcase and a shoulder bag, and thinking on the way there, this is going to be, you know, if it's going to be my fault if it goes right and my fault if it goes wrong. And I just thought, this is it. I was about 23, 24, so I thought this is the right time to do it.
So brave.
And then once again, I eventually got a job at a post house in Soho. Once again, doing linear online editing, but in the next room was this Avid, which I'd heard about, never seen. And from all those years of trying to, you know, work linearly, and I remember, you know, they said, go and have a play with it. So I put a shot there, I put a clip there, and I put a clip there. And then when I took this third clip and put it in between, the first and the second one, I was completely flummoxed. And I ran into my manager and said, this is the most exciting machine I've ever seen. And so it was then a very slow process from sort of moving from online, finishing other people's work, to suddenly getting the itch that, you know, programs would come in. And I eventually learned a machine called Smoke, which is a subset of Flame. So it's like a Flame machine, but for editors. But all the time finishing other people's thing and having, you know, once again, that arrogance of thinking, oh, you know, I wouldn't have put the cut there, I wouldn't have done that, all that kind of thing. Anyway, I was working at a facility and a job came in, and they wanted my boss. They said, we've got this great comedy series, and you know, we'd love to do it, and we'd love you, John, to do it, and we think you'd be right for it. And John said, well, this is great, but we've got this young guy called Paul, and we think this is more suited for this machine, Smoke, and we think you should give him a chance. And they said, okay, we'll give him a chance. And so I was told, okay, so Monday morning, director's going to come in, and you're going to start work on kind of onlining this first series. And so at that Monday morning, a very young kid called Edgar Wright came in, and it was my first day working with him on a show called Spaced.
Oh.
And that's how that started. And so we immediately kind of hit it off. We both realized we had that kind of OCD thing where, you know, to get it right, it took time. You know, the job order might have said 10 a.m. till 6 p.m., but that just went out the window as we kind of sat there trying to get all the effects and the things right. And that was great fun. And then basically jump forward a few years. I'm still online editing, but just desperate to get out of it now. And suddenly the second series of Space comes up. Chris Dickens cut the first series, but then Chris wasn't able to finish the second one. So suddenly I get a call from the producer saying, Edgar was wondering if you'd like to come over and finish editing the second series. And of course, yes. And so that was the other big thing, is like, okay, so I'm in quite a secure full-time job. I am now about to take the leap because they wouldn't keep me on if I was doing freelance offline editing or proper editing. So I said, right, I'm going to go freelance, and with one client. And I thought, but I've got to do this. I've got to do this. And so that was the other big leap, was to suddenly jump in. And of course, that was totally in the deep end because, you know, then getting to grips very quickly with Edgar's style, but actually getting on board with those creative decisions. And thankfully, those years of just watching other people's and then trying it on your own and just realizing what works, you know. And then it was the inner monologue that I had with Edgar. We just kind of clicked. And so Space worked very well, but it was really tough because of the disregard for the schedule. Christmas came, we'd only delivered 4 out of the 7 episodes, and the producer said, we're just going to have to work every single day to get this done and to get it delivered to the network. So we did about 50 days in a row without having a day off.
Whoa.
It's not right, but it was the only way we could do it. So it was really.
Are you okay now?
Just about recovered from that. But then, you know, and funny enough, that was the one point in my career that I thought, oh, if it's always going to be like this, do I really want to do this? And then I took a couple of months off actually until the producer Naira Park then said, "Actually, Paul, there's this little show called Black Books. If you're interested in doing Black Books," so I said, "Yeah, sure." It was a different team and all of that. So I then spent the next 10 years actually, best part of it, doing TV comedy, and really for me it was living the high life in terms of really what I wanted to do. And that was great, and so I had a fantastic time, worked on some really amazing programs. And then once again, about 2009, Edgar comes back into my life because Chris Dickens, who'd cut Shaun of the Dead and Hot Fuzz, then he won an Oscar and did very well for Slumdog Millionaire. So of course he was basically off on another orbit, and then Edgar once again just came knocking at the door and said, "Hey, this little film I've got, Scott Pilgrim, would you be up for doing that?" And I said, "Well, okay." So a move from TV to feature, and a little bit like you, Tom, Universal were like, he hasn't actually cut any. Is he any good? And they really didn't want myself and John Amos, my co-editor, to do it. And Edgar and Naira were very protective, basically saying, "Listen, if you don't like what they do, you can fire them, basically, but just give them a chance." But of course, I'd known Edgar so well that it was going to work out. I mean, it was tough, and suddenly being in that big arena, and Scott Pilgrim, I think for me was about 20 months from start to finish. I mean, it was a long shoot schedule, and then a full year's post schedule where it's great when you sit at the cutting room and you look out the window and you go, "Oh look, spring's come round again," So that was another big thing, and I sort of figured, if this is, but this is the way Edgar works, and you can't make his kind of omelette without breaking some very, very big eggs, and then basically from that point it was working with several other directors. Edgar would always come back, and I'd had the pleasure of World's End, and then Baby Driver, and now we're right in the middle of doing his next magnum opus, Last Night in Soho, which is incredibly exciting.
Very excited.
Yeah,
and
it's going to be
also because it's our home. It's our
yes,
spiritual home.
Yeah, and it's
right?
basically Edgar's love letter to Soho, which I think is rapidly disappearing in the face of all the corporate. You see half the place being knocked down and things like that. So it's a real shame. But for someone who just wanted to come over here, and I couldn't have told you, I couldn't have guaranteed, I couldn't tell you how it happened. There was no plan.
Your bold moves. That's how it happened. Like, you made incredibly bold moves.
Well, there was that, and also that thing that I believe that luck is when timing meets preparation as well. It's like when that coincidence, when that moment occurs, if you're ready and you can sort of grab it, then that that just pays off. Anyway, I've rabbited on.
No, not at all. It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. Jeremiah.
Yeah.
How did you make your jump? Because you were an assistant for a while.
I was
right?
my plan was to be the world's oldest assistant editor. And then I got foiled in that plan. I was doing really well for a while there. But at any rate, so I kind of fell into it because the one thing I did bring with me from undergraduate film production at NYU was an ability to fix moviolas. So when I was living in Maine, working at Maine Public Broadcasting Network, a movie was coming to town. It was a Stephen King movie. So I thought, well, I guess I'll put in a resume. So I didn't want to write a bunch of student movies on the resume. So I said, I know how to fix all this equipment. A moviola, a Steenbeck, of Cinemonta, whoever uses that. Anyway, and whoever was flipping through the resumes put me in the cutting room, which was a British crew. It was, it was really crazy. The movie was Creepshow 2, immortal movie. Stephen King was in it, and so was Tabitha. So that's, anyway. And so...
I saw it in the theater. I remember.
That's weird.
I know it is weird.
Nobody saw that movie. Anyway, the first one's the good one, the cockroach one.
Right.
Mine wasn't that one. It was, anyway, so I was the apprentice on that, and it was 18 hours a day. I was at the Acme British system, which means you code every individual foot Every take has its own unique code, sound and picture. So you're sitting over this hot machine burning graphite, so you stink. My wife still probably remembers the stink of that machine. Anyway, it was a nightmare. And it was exciting, but it was the mid '80s. It was insane. It was all night shooting in Maine in the fall and winter, and by the end we were painting snow brown, all kinds of things. So once I finished that job, I didn't want to have anything to do with a cutting room, and I didn't know where I would fit in. I went back to Atlanta where my family lived, and because I had no other skill, I decided to see if there was a lab in town, a lab that would develop film, and I found one that developed a lot of film for commercials and industrial films and like that sort of thing. And I went to them and I said, well, I'm a very, very experienced first assistant. And, I just want to let you know that I'm moved back to town. And should any show coming through your lab need an assistant, I might think about doing it. And believe it.
With my present.
Which was totally, I don't know who that person is anymore because it's not me. But I did it, and they called 2 weeks later. They said a production's coming to town. I met the editor. He was very nice. I felt, awful in taking advantage of him, but he hired me, and and then I thought, well, all I know how to do is sync Daileies. I don't know, and how to code. Of course, I was a master at the Acme. So the first day in the room, I thought up this lie, and I'm kind of like, I have to just make it through today, which is what most of my career has been that way. So I said to the editor, I have all this experience, but it's all been with British crews. So just show me in great detail exactly how you want me to do everything, and I will promise you to give you exactly what you show me to do.
I'm stealing that.
Oh my gosh. So anyway, somehow I survived that. And
That wasn't my father.
That was not Sid. That wasn't Sid and Jenny. That came later. That's where the story starts to get good in a couple of years. So right around that time, I started doing a lot of stuff on location. There was, in fact, the time I met Jenny, there had been a writer's strike in LA, so a lot of shows started to go to the South, which is right to work, meaning you can work even if you're not a union member. So many shows came through town, and sometimes I was working on 3 movies at the same time, or TV movies, Hallmark Hall of Fame. I worked on Driving Miss Daisy, which was wonderful. I worked with Sid and Ginny Katz on a TV movie called Traveling Man with Irving Kershner directing, who is the sweetest man ever. Yep. That was such a great experience.
John Lithgow. That was like one of the first movies that I ever saw him in.
Yeah. No, it was a great experience. And Jenny taught me, she gave me the golden ticket because at some point she taught me how to synchronize the picture and the sound in only one pass through the synchronizer. You taught me that. Anyway, so that was great because then I could work even faster. And so years went on and all these things happened. And there was at one point I was tired of the TV movie. So a feature was coming to town called Career Opportunities, which had been written by John Hughes. And so I really wanted to get on a feature instead of TV work or cable work, So I went to the guy who I rented the space from at the lab, and he says, "No, we have you on this other show. You can't go do that show." And I'm kind of like, I'm a freelance guy. Do you think you can tell me what I'm going to do or not? So I walk into the office of Career Opportunities with my resume in my hand, and I know everyone there because I've done like 30 shows with the same crew. And some producer grabs it out of my hand and says, "Come into my office," and says, "Sit down, tell me everything about Post here." And I said, "Oh, yeah, sure. Don't get your act made from Miami. Get it from LA. Send the Kim from, this place. Don't go to that place. It's a ripoff. I'm going to be spending my whole time fixing it. So, I already had 3 different jobs that I was doing, and I would very carefully sort of structure what my responsibility was so I could do all of them. I might synchronize one from 8 in the morning till 10, go to the other one late at night. I'd screen another one, Daileies, whatever it was, but I never stopped working. And so he said, well, we would love to have you on this show, but unfortunately your calendar doesn't, we can't possibly go without an apprentice for a month into the shoot. And I said, whatever it takes, I will work for you for free every spare moment I have for the first month. And then when my priority shows are gone, I will not take another priority show until your show is done. And he bought it. So, and that one was a nightmare too. Most of them were a nightmare. But,
You are.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's kind of interesting because you really have to suffer. It feels like, at some point, or you have to put yourself over, in the deep end of the pool at some point, or lie like I did. But anyway.
I see you do not advocate lying. Disclaimer.
If it works. No. So 2 years later, I went on, about my merry way doing all these movies. The phone rings, and it's Hunt Lowry again, the same producer for whom I worked for free. He said, we're doing this movie in North Carolina. It's going to be wonderful. We have to chopper the crew in and remote locations. It's going to be a real challenge. Michael Mann's directing the thing. And I'm kind of like, okay, well, I'm on RoboCop 3, and I'm kind of comfortable with that job. And he's like, oh, come on, you need to... Because he knew I would project and be the apprentice editor for the one low price. So I said, who's cutting it? And he says, Arthur Schmidt. And I said, I'm there. And Artie Schmidt was just like, God descends from the mountain. So, and he didn't trust me at all. But anyway, he knew I was a flim-flam guy. I'd just talk up anyway.
So how many films did you do with?
I ended up sticking with him for 11 years.
That's amazing.
Yeah, we went from Mohicans. So Mohicans was a non-union show that then was picketed and became a union show. So I was put into the Editors Guild on that show. And then I went back to California for the first time for post on that. Artie had to leave to do Death Becomes Her. I tried to stay. It didn't work out because of various reasons, having to do it with emotional well-being, but and health and exhaustion. But so I went to work for Artie as the apprentice on Death Becomes Her, which was my first Emeka show and my first big Hollywood show with Meryl Streep and Goldie Hawn, and it was kind of amazing. Isabella Rossellini, wow. So yeah, I was just in hog heaven. And then I stuck with Artie for, gosh, I never counted the number of shows, but it was 11 years, a lot. We did Forrest Gump, we did The Birdcage with Mike Nichols, we did Primary Colors with Mike Nichols, we did Adam's Family Values with Sonnenfeld, of course the Zemeckis movies. I could never, he would never let me cut anything on film. And it was only when we got to the Avid, our first film on Avid was The Birdcage. Both of us had to learn on the location with a tutor who's Dana Glauberman, who's an absolutely wonderful editor. Anyway, Dana was my co-first and, our Avid tutor. So that was a revelation and a wonderful movie, a wonderful experience.
So what did he give you to cut? Did he give you then a scene in the Avid?
On that, I didn't. I wasn't experienced enough to do it. So what happened was a few years later, on Contact, there was this opening audio montage, which in the script it was described pretty much the way it showed up in the movie. And Artie said from day one, we're going to have a whole department at Skywalker researching this thing and putting it together, right? And everyone said, yes, right. And then one day, as the budget dwindled, Mr. Zemeckis turned around in the cutting chair to the guy taking the notes on the back couch saying, hey, why don't you cut this? And I'm like, sure. And it nearly killed me. But I did get it done.
Great.
Yeah. It was and it was on the free version of Pro Tools, which had only 7 channels. So I would take all the music and dub it down to like 2 channels. And then, of course, you forget what you did and all kinds of stuff. I kept crashing. Anyway, somehow I survived. And we did, so that was the first thing I cut. And Artie had me start to cut on scenes in the movie. And he would watch me do it at the Avid, which was, I know. I was kind of like,
you did over you or just
he would sit right behind me, and I was like, well, you didn't say anything about it. Go away. I can't anyway, of course you think it's a lift, and then there it is in the movie, so my kids run it anyway. So that happened, and then Castaway, I cut a bunch of stuff. I would assemble a lot. Primary Colors with Mike Nichols again was a movie where we overlapped by 2 months into shooting. So there was an entire wall of film when we got there in Daileies. And this first night, Artie realized most of it was uncut. He joked on his way out saying, well, why don't you cut all this stuff? And I said, oh, okay. So when he came in the morning, I showed him 3 scenes.
Nice.
And, it was Nichols, so it was easy to cut. I don't know who would be intimidated by, he's a puppy dog. So anyway, so then we'd continue a bit like that. Yeah. And
you took the opportunity. Like, he sort of said it's a throwaway comment, and you were like, I'm on it. I'm doing it.
Yeah. I'm not going to, not do that.
Yeah.
So then it came about that we did Castaway. I did cut a lot of stuff on that, including that was my first thing where I guess I'd done a few plane crashes in my day. But, I think that was the first. Anyway, so after Castaway, Bob was going to do this funky thing, and he wanted to do an animatic or a Leica reel, as we call it, for Polar Express, and he was going to do it, and it's going to help him write the script at the same time. It was sort of like both making a story reel and that. And Artie, having gone through, as much as he loved Roger Rabbit, he didn't want to get that deep into animation again. So they sort of hired me to do the animatic. And so we did that, and I did the voice of the know-it-all kid, of course. Hey, that kid says we're on the ice. That's impossible. So anyway, except Eddie Deason speaks much faster. So anyway, so then they said, well, you guys, because it was me and Orlando Duenas, who was like Artie's Avid first. And we were being paid as first assistants, which is plenty of money, but it's not editor wages. And they said, well, if it gets a green light, we'll bump you up. And I go, oh, okay. But we're going to have this reserve for Artie to come and fix all the problems. And I go, hey, if I can have Artie Schmidt fix my things, that's the deal. And then we just rolled into shooting, and it never stopped. And, about a month into shooting, I was sitting at the Avid going, I'm cutting the movie. Don't think about it. Just get through today. Just get through this scene here. And every day it was like, just make it to the end of the day. And eventually, they spent the money they set aside for Artie on other things, and that was that.
Amazing.
Yeah. So then I stuck with Zemeckis ever since, which I thought was a weird choice for him because, although I knew him really well and his taste and how he likes to cut, I always thought, if you don't work with Artie Schmidt, you're going to get Michael Kahn or some other A-lister, But so I don't know. So I went all to that.
I have a feeling you charmed him.
No, not Bob.
You're charming us.
He's from Chicago.
No. He's so through it.
Yeah, so hopefully that doesn't.
Okay. No, No, that's
Blow our
wonderful.
time.
No, goodness, no, not at all.
Yeah.
So we're gonna play some clips in a little bit.